right, good afternoon. I mean, we're having our last panel. I mean, we already addressed many topics today. I mean, including external, domestic issues in Central Asia, which raises, I mean, all that raises many questions for foreign actors, in particular, what's the role of the United States, and what is the role of other foreign actors, how they can be engaged and how they are engaged in the region. So this will be the topic of our of this fourth panel, entitled "What Role for the US in Central Asia?" And we're going to start with Gavin Helf, who is working as United States Institute of Peace, and who's going to talk on new opportunities for US engagement in the new 2023 context. Gavin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sebastien, and thank you, everyone. I mean, one of the interesting things about going last is if you're correct, then everybody's already said everything that you're going to say. So I'm looking at Alex, going back to the very beginning, but I think a lot of this will be confirmation of a lot of the things that we've discussed today. And I think this is a really, unique time in America's formulation of its position vis-a-vis Central Asia. In the past, and I would, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but let's say from 92 to 2001, a lot of what US policy was focused on was sovereignty, containment of Russia, and pipelines, right? Back in that day, the US ambassador in Kazakhstan, Beth Jones, had a bumper sticker on her car that said "Happiness is multiple pipelines." We were interested in getting it was underneath Central Asia and keeping Russia, which was next to Central Asia, away. And then obviously for a good 20 years, from 2001 to 2021, as one to be unnamed Central Asian ambassador in this city explained to me once, yes, the US Central Asia strategy is Afghanistan, 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 and China, or democracy. And the secret version is Afghanistan, 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 China. And won't it be nice now, after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, if you could write a policy that actually mentioned the name of one of the 5 countries in it? So we were very focused on Central Asia as so many rest stops on the turnpike to Afghanistan. How do we use Afghanistan to help support our efforts? How do we use Central Asia to help support those efforts? So our interest in Central Asia has largely been instrumental. It's been about what Central Asia is next to and what Central Asia is between. I guess I would like to say, on the one hand, this is our first opportunity to try to define a policy towards Central Asia that actually is Central Asia centric. I think looking at how things are developing, it may very well be that what we're seeing right now is a shift from an Afghanistan-centric Central Asia policy to a Ukraine-centric Central Asia policy. But I'm going to be a little bit optimistic and talk about what it looks like to me American strategy in Central Asia is shaping up to be. 2023, as we've reviewed, is a very different world, either than 2001 or 1992. US leverage in the region, we'll start with that, is at a low point. Our reputation after the withdrawal from Afghanistan is at a low point. And this is something that I've heard repeatedly in meetings in Central Asia. We're not happy with the way we left Afghanistan, but it really casts a lot of doubt on the role of America or the staying power of America as a partner. So our leverage is very low. It's low also in terms of the level of attention that we have to pay to Central Asia. So we're really working with a lot less than we've had in the past as well, which may lead to some reflection. On the other hand, as we sort of hinted at and talked about earlier, both Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping have personally visited Central Asia to reinforce their interest in the region over the last year. But there's really been a change. Russia, as we've discussed earlier, is now threatening ideologically. As Alex pointed out, the justification for invading Ukraine applies to northern Kazakhstan and the other countries of Central Asia, should they decide to do that. So Russia's slightly threatening. It is economically less helpful because of sanctions than the sanctions bubble around Central Asia. And its ability to intervene militarily, even if it wants to, has now been diverted or deflated. But Russia's ability to be a military umbrella, a security umbrella for the region is greatly diminished. The other thing, which I think is a consequence of especially the Russian deflation, is the rise of middle powers and regional powers in the engagements that the countries of Central Asia have. I am impressed when I look at my news line, the number of foreign minister of Uzbekistan is in India or in Iran, or the amount of engagement that's coming from regional powers, India, Iran, Turkey. Turkey's very strong push to turn what was essentially a linguistic affinity group into an organization of Turkic states that even takes on, with the increase in sort of sales of drones, a military aspect. Iran's re-engagement and Iran selling drones to Persian-speaking, Farsi-speaking Tajikistan as well. So there's a lot going on there that is filling the gap of what happens when you've got Russia distracted in Ukraine, a United States that's pulled out, and a China that maybe hasn't completely figured out yet or made a decision about what kind of a role it wants to play in the region. And I would say what this calls for on the American side is a recognition that we're never going to be the big actor. We're never going to be the big actor militarily, economically, or politically in the region, and we should probably approach a Central Asia strategy and approach Central Asia with a much more humble set of foreign policies and goals. And what I see developing, and I think this is what was congealing in my mind before Secretary Blinken's visit, but I think I've read in what I've seen from that trip and what I've heard from that trip, signs that there are really two now main thrusts of American foreign policy that I think match this more humble circumstance that we find ourselves in. First, how can the United States help the countries of the region find ways to connect to the outside world or reconnect to the outside world in ways that are not completely dependent on Russia and don't leave it as a resource colony of China? I think the way that I would say this to a diplomat from Central Asia, or especially to a diplomat from Kazakhstan, would be, let us help your multi-vector policy be more balanced in its multi-vectorness, right? I think it's what are those things? How can we help? Well, the first we sort of mentioned, I think the majority of the conversations that have been happening with the governments of the region and the State Department have a lot to do in the last year and a half with sanctions relief, how to avoid secondary sanctions, how to do cutouts, how to ensure that Central Asian goods have an ability to get out, because the point really of sanctions is to punish Russia, diminish Russia's capability of waging war in Ukraine, not to punish people in countries that happen to be located next to Russia. One of the things, again, that might be helpful is using our good offices, or to borrow a phrase, the collective West, providing opportunities for alternative labor migration destinations. Not part of being multi-vector is maybe you could send some labor migrants someplace other than Russia, so that there's a little bit of diversity in that. Obviously, a lot of conversations about the middle corridor. How can we help Central Asia break out of the sanctions bubble that it finds itself in? It isn't sanctioned itself, but it is completely surrounded by sanctions, with the exception of the Caspian and the Caucasus. And then one that I thought was a really bright idea, but my wife talked about already, which is how can we help these countries with energy transition? If we're looking at a world, let's be really optimistic, and if we're looking at a world in 15 years where hydrocarbons aren't the main source of energy, what does that mean for Central Asia, which basically has drugs, people, and hydrocarbons to share with the outside world? How can we help them? So that's objective one. How do we help these countries reconnect in better ways to the outside world? That's not saying that they have to connect to us or that we're going to do a lot of investment, but how do we help them be more multi-vector? And then second is the one I can still remember at the time, Foreign Minister Kamilov from Uzbekistan saying, "We are stronger together. We are stronger as five. Five fingers are stronger, together." How can we, and this is a very complicated and difficult thing to say as an outside power, but how do we help the countries of the region cohere as a unit of 76 million with substantial resources, human and otherwise, to share with the outside world, rather than being five smallish countries, the conflicts between which can provide openings to other countries to play games with them. And I think the first one, and I very much have become a fan of Secretary Blinken and Don Liu on this particular aspect, respect their multi-vector foreign policy. I've had so many conversations with diplomats from Central Asia where, we're trying to get them to pick our side. Pick our side against Russia, really? Oh, pick our side against China, really? Come on, say malign Chinese influence for me. When there's a good reason that they have a multi-vector foreign policy. The Onion ran a piece in 2008 or 2009 that said Condoleezza Rice recommends to former Soviet countries to stop being located next to Russia. They're always going to have Russia as a more important neighbor than us as a distant friend. Increase the level and frequency of U.S. diplomatic engagement. For goodness sake, Xi Jinping and I don't know how many times Vladimir Putin's been down there, in the last year and a half. Xi Jinping's first visit outside of China after COVID was Astana. And we've got Anthony Blinken to go. That's a step in the right direction. Be engaged. It's amazing. It's phenomenal to me how much it means to have that level of engagement, to know that the Americans aren't forgetting completely. More soft power engagement. This is where we started with education programs. Back a long time ago, used to be the regional director for IREX, the Flex program, the Muskie program, the graduate program. How do you create long-term change? Those Flex students are a generation of change, and I run into Flex students all over Central Asia who are now grown up and working in the government, and they still have perfect English and they still have very positive attitudes towards the United States. That's the best kind of soft power. Cross-border community confidence building and resource sharing. And one of the things, one of my favorite moments when we've got this C5+1 track 2 initiative at USIP that we do that parallels the State Department program. We've got a group of younger scholars. We call them emergent leaders. They come in and we sort of we have a day of brainstorming with them, and then they get to be the keynotes at our conferences instead of like old oxycols going out there and telling them what their strategic interests are in English. And one of the really interesting things that they come up with is, let's stop talking about demarcating the borders. Let's start talking about tearing the borders down and reestablishing connections between the communities across those borders. You don't need an armed corridor between Varuk and Tajikistan that looks like Root Irish in Baghdad back in the day with T-walls. You need to break those down and build those communities, not towards maybe integration, but towards refamiliarization. We can help with that. And then finally, I would say I haven't quite figured this out, but one of the things that I think is really important, it keeps coming up both among authoritarian and less authoritarian leaders in the region is how can we use social media? How can we use internet? How can we use that to be a positive in this equation rather than a negative? Right now, when I look at what happens between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan and social media, when there's a conflict on the border, it's completely out of control, and it sweeps up, people who otherwise should be talking sense. How can we turn that around? How can we use it? I actually think that there's a real opening in all of these countries to work with governments and with civil society and the populations to think about how to use social media in a way that's positive. So leaving it at this, I think a humble American policy in the region, one I think that we're moving towards is luckily help them connect to the outside world in a better way. Help them hold together as a unit and become stronger. Do it with humility, and don't try to make them pick our side over the other side, because we might not like how that comes out. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gavin. So we have on this panel Assel Tutumlu, who works at the nearest university in Turkey, but who is currently in Almaty. So I have a little request, if you don't mind. It's very, very late there.
Yeah.
It's almost 2 a.m. So we could give her the floor now, take a couple of questions, and let her go to bed because she really deserves that, I guess. So Assel, thank you so much. I had no idea you were in Almaty today, so thank you so much for being with us, and the floor is yours. So
thank you. Thank you so much. Can you hear me, Sebastien?
Yeah, I can. And sorry, I forgot to specify that your present. Oh,
you need to stop sharing on that.
Yeah, I'm gonna call that. No, the title of your presentation is "The Turkish Factor in Central Asia: Aspirations and Capacity." We can hear you, Assel, no problem.
Okay, thank you so much. I don't have a PowerPoint, but it's a pleasure to be here and meet people whom I know, and looking forward to meeting and knowing more. Just wanted to kind of have a brief presentation and interpretation of Turkish foreign policy from the perspective of neo-Ottomanism. And this is obviously a topic that may not necessarily, the concept itself may divide academic community, but at the same time, it seems very applicable, particularly because since 2013, Turkey turned away from pro-Western integration policies towards a very strong kind of Ottoman revivalist discourse and engaged in a kind of a collection of historical and political influence in lands through economic and mainly as well political instruments as well. And when we look at this neo-Ottomanist frame, it's important to understand that it's highly anti-Kemalist, so it goes against Kemalist ideology that was highly secularist, and now it uses populist conservative Islamist discourse in order to really kind of split the politics into kind of us and them. And it also translates into the foreign policy as well, as more and more politicized identities appear, where Turkey presents itself as a kind of a model of political Islam, and with a very strong disdain to the West and Western ideas. And it also speaks towards authoritarian system in Central Asia that enables kind of or offers an alternative to a US foreign policy that Gavin has been talking about, of democracy, Afghanistan, and so on. So it offers an opportunity to understand, so to say, or to recreate some kind of mythical brotherly union of communities that are presumably understanding each other on a much deeper level. And it also has a kind of a very strong pragmatic deployment of the imperial discourses, which celebrates the Muslim subjects and also defines the enemies from within and outside. And this type of techniques are also very keen and very close to the Central Asian autocrats as well. So the shift in this foreign policy translated into its change in the relations with Central Asian states and Caucasus, where before 2013, for example, Turkey was a relatively minor actor, mostly engaged in symbolic and largely symbolic presence, limited to consumer goods, shuttle traders. After 2010, Turkish companies started to occupy specific domestic markets. So they were present, for example, in construction, in services, in education, and therefore the organizational structure for such cooperation also increased. So we have seen, for example, multiple organizations that began to appear and multiple additional structures within the organization of Turkey speaking nations. However, the desire to safeguard a stronger role in the region was limited as Turkish foreign policy engagement required bigger investments and institutionalization. So in 2015, Turkish economic situation was relatively stable, prosperous, for such foreign policy, and domestically Turkish rhetoric approached the region from a kind of a big brother status. For Central Asians, for the population in general, this was a kind of a déjà vu because we have already experienced the big brother status mentality in 1990s, and Turkey was really kind of pushed away, asking for a relatively equal status. So Turkey right now talks about or treats Central Asian states as the origins, so to say, as where the original Turks came from. But it also has, in the domestic discourse, it does speak with a kind of a very strong kind of imperial idea, not necessarily towards Central Asia, but saying that Turkey and the Turks in Turkey basically managed and figured out how to revive the power around the world. And it also translated into the diverse presence across different levels, from local to national. So in addition to different things that I've outlined before, it now opened up opportunities for exchange programs, health opportunities, Turkish products and services, appear pretty much and exist pretty much everywhere across the board, from local to national level. And for the governments of Central Asia, Turkey offers an alternative ally, which is going beyond the conventional Russia-China. During COVID, Turkish aspirations have actually expanded. And it's kind of ironic because the capacity, and this is the reason why I wanted to bring this talk, or that's the reason why I titled the presentation this way, because aspirations have expanded, but the capacities have actually shrunk tremendously. So Turkey managed to kind of create a more prominent role in local conflicts, acting as a peace builder and a mediator. Obviously, it's a very controversial position, especially in its conflict, in its engagement in conflict with Armenia and Azerbaijan. But nonetheless, it has continuous conversations with Armenia, for example, and potentially Turkish. This type of mediation can also serve in the conflict between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. So far, none of these things have happened, but Turkey does want to position itself as a kind of an actor that is understanding both sides, has historical links with Kyrgyzstan, and also can potentially act as a neutral actor because it has links within Central Asia. The second thing, that it also became a more prominent security actor. We have seen that some people, some presentations have mentioned that Turkey is heavily engaged in the sales of technology, and especially military technology for Central Asian states, and particularly drones. Turkey signed deals with Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Kazakhstan. It did try to sell its drones to Tajikistan, but since Kyrgyzstan protested, Iran stepped in instead. Turkish drones are much more attractive to Central Asian states because the war in Libya showed that Chinese versions, for example, are less effective. And it also acts as a kind of a guarantor of sovereignty and territorial integrity, which was mentioned in several summits, especially in the last fall, both in the multilateral and bilateral forums. And lastly, it offers an alternative source or alternative routes and outlets to the world, as I think Gavin has mentioned as well, where we can see that Turkey can potentially offer alternative infrastructure outside, again, of Russia and China. So, for example, just recently, before the gas union, so to say, or the informal gas union materialized, there was a possibility of, for example, connecting the Turkmen gas and in general Central Asian, but Turkmen gas to Turkey, and that would be a shift from the conventional market, Chinese market, for example. Turkey was also very successful in negotiating grain deal as well, as we all know. So in general, Turkey is very much present in various conflicts, offers negotiations, and also acts as a kind of a voice of the South, a voice of the people, that has access to the main stakeholders, that has understanding, that has something to offer to the people that it brings to the table. And this type of positionality is interesting because it actually may not necessarily require that much of investment and that much of commitment, material commitment in particular. And this is important because the domestic capacity is relatively weak. We have seen that Turkey has actually faced diminishing foreign reserves and foreign exchange. I mean, its foreign reserves are so low that in the past year it's decreased from nearly 83,000 to 1660 to about 69,700 million. And so that's why Turkey does face a relatively strong inflation that translates into only 55% on the official basis. However, Turkey has adopted a decree. Actually, it's illegal to count inflation outside of the official formula that is used. It actually closed several independent think tanks that calculated the real inflation. And it's important for Turkey because official inflation is included into the salary raises, for example. It also included into rental contracts. And therefore, the government prefers to keep the inflation as low as possible. So the various formulas, for example, showed that Turkey was inflation in Turkey was third highest in the world. All of that led to the situation in which we have the rising prices and lower standards of living. So not only that the cost of rent has increased tremendously, but the cost of everything has skyrocketed. And it created a very strong pressure on the quality of life of ordinary people, where we have, for example, just in January, we have seen that food and non-alcoholic beverages went 71%, increased 71%. Housing and utilities increased by 56%, household equipment maintenance by 62% nearly, education by 41%, and it just goes on and on. I mean, just to kind of give you an idea that domestically the situation is not necessarily strong. And what we have seen as a result of this diminishing quality of life, more and more people began to began looking for culprits. So we have seen that more and more people in public are actually blaming the existence of 4 million Syrian refugees, and the rhetoric, the electoral debates actually show that both sides are actually prepared to address this issue, not necessarily from the perspective of a humanitarian crisis and the law and the international law, but from the fact that trying to kind of victimize and blame Syrian refugees for the increasing prices, for the informal work, for everything that that conventionally we do hear, for example, from the illegal migrants rhetoric in the US or in Europe. And the earthquake and flooding also added to that situation where now millions of people are moving out of the region, looking for work. Mainly they're going to the big cities, both in the north, in the east, and in the south. And that also adds pressure to the overall infrastructure in these big cities. Turkey is also the Turkish regime, the Erdogan's regime, is very much busy with the elections and currently faces the unified opposition, but nonetheless, opposition itself has a lot of clashes inside. So it's not necessarily as solid as it may seem. So as a result of that, I do see in the future that Turkey will probably remain a kind of pragmatic actor with very ambitious interest in maximization of gains and presence and influence in the region. And in doing so, it will try to offer alternative routes to Central Asian goods and resources. And it will act in a kind of, may not necessarily be called an imperial way, but as a savior of Turkic brothers who got stuck between, in a kind of very unfortunate geography, and Turkey can share its central position between Europe, Africa, and Asia to offer this type of salvation to the Turkish state. It will also probably will enter other aspects of or other facets of military market and provide a very vocal guarantee of territorial integrity and national sovereignty that is important given the context of the Russian war in Ukraine. So that's basically what I wanted to say, and I'm ready to address the questions.
Thank you so much, Assel. So yes, let's take a couple of questions. Give you a chance to go to bed after that. Questions, please. Sorry, well, yeah. Yeah. Wait for the microphone.
Hi, this question is for Gavin. Thank you so much for your.
No, sorry. For now, we're going to take some questions to and we'll move back to the question to the panel. Sorry. Laura, yes, please go ahead. No, sorry, we need the microphone, Laura.
Hi, Laura Kennedy. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm a former U.S. diplomat, and I was serving in Turkey when independence occurred. And the one thing that I would differ with in some of the presentation was in the sense that Turkey came later on the scene. I thought Turkey jumped in extraordinarily. So President Demirel would talk to us all the time. I mean, Turkey went from being an assistance receiving nation to creating its version of AID, and it was specifically focused on Central Asia, and incredible programs they started off with. I mean, I was reporting on them to Washington and saying, this is exactly what we should be doing. But to me, so one of the things I wanted to ask about was the big difference I see as time's gone along is that Turkey no longer seeks to partner with the US in terms of Central Asia. whether it's security, economic programs, and so on, which is what I did see in the beginning. So to me, as I say, that seems to be a major change, and I just wanted to see what you thought about that. Thank you.
Sebastien, can I answer?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you so much for the note. Well, it's actually the official influence from the, if you judge from the a kind of a diplomatic point of view, Turkey was the first country to recognize Central Asian states. It did establish the aid packages, but the thing is that the policy, even though it was active at the beginning of the 1990s, this policy kind of failed, and that's particularly because Central Asian states, both the people and the government, were not necessarily happy with the terms of engagement. The terms of engagement were kind of superior, where Turkey came in with the idea that we will teach you how to live because you guys have been under the Soviet rule for so long, so you don't necessarily know how things should be. And despite these things that Turkey was very active diplomatically, it established with the support of government, it established various programs, but nonetheless, they were not effective on the ground. And so that's why, yes, Turkey had a lot of visibility initially, but then its actual influence was not necessarily important. In terms of the partnering with the United States, well, that I think it is explained with the fact that after 2013, I think AKP party, together with President Erdogan, just simply decided to turn elsewhere. They were disillusioned and disenchanted with the EU accession, and decided to basically stick to independent foreign policy, looking for own niches, let's say, of engagement where they can be useful. And that also explains the fact that the Turkish version of USAID has actually now has shifted away from Turkic states in 2000s, and now mostly concentrates on Africa, with Sudan being the largest recipient. That's the policy that has been tied to the disillusionment with with the EU accession, actually.
Any other question for Assel? Yes, Alex.
Hi, thanks so much. Could you comment, what's your perspective on the whole evolution of the Gulenis schools and, you know, that arc and where we stand now, and you know, has the government pretty much achieved everything it wanted to in terms of both shutting these down and the individuals involved?
Thank you. Well, with the Gulenis schools, I think it really depends on country by country. So, for example, in Kyrgyzstan and Azerbaijan, the schools were actually closed. But in Kazakhstan, they were kept, and they were kept particularly because the rhetoric was that it's not necessarily the Gulenis schools; it's actually the schools that are operating under the license of the official Ministry of Education, and so they kept operating. Today, however, we can see that the overall network of the schools remained, but and it's still they still do operate. But in Kazakhstan, for example, we have the Nazarbayev schools that are rivaling the Gulenist schools, or the former what were they called? Kazakh Turkish lyceums, right? So KTL. And so the graduates of KTL have been occupying most of the places in the academic and scientific competitions versus the Nazarbayev schools. And so there was a kind of informal decision, let's say, to rather than improving the Nazarbayev's curriculum, Nazarbayev school's curriculum, they were trying to undermine the feasibility and the the quality of KTL schools. So it really depends on country by country basis. What's interesting, and I can tell you because I also worked for a Gulen institution in Turkey, and I was actually deported from Turkey, but I won the court case, so my reputation is clean. But it's actually they have just now decided to pay every faculty members the specific payment that is guaranteed based on each year that you've worked in the institution. So I'm guessing that slowly the kind of a very demonic image of Gulen will subside and people's careers will be reinstated in some way or fashion.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. I think we need to let you go to bed, Assel. So I would really like to thank you for staying with us so late. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much. I'll try to stay up as much as possible, but I'm not really guaranteeing it. It's 2:15. Thank you.
So our next speaker will be Elizabeth Wishnick, who is going to talk about China's approach to Central Asia since February 2022 and its geopolitical implications.
Thank you, Sebastien. It's a pleasure to participate in this conference, and especially to note that the theme was not Central Asia as an arena for great power competition, which is so often prominently displayed in policy commentary and in some academic works. But there is another assumption that we often hear nowadays, and that is, as Russian influence declines, China's influence increases. And so I'm going to speak to this assumption, which I think is false. And this is partly a response to a recent Fulbright exchange I had in Kazakhstan in this fall, where I was talking to a range of experts about their views of China and China's influence in the region. And so I'm not going to talk very much about China's economic influence. I think we're all aware of it. It's very important in the region. It differs by country. It's substantial. It's not going away. But I would like to talk about how China is viewed as a security actor in the region, what China hopes to achieve in the region, and look at some of the risks that China perceives itself facing there and how other countries experience China's role, and then draw some conclusions in terms of alternatives for the region. So one of the striking conclusions that I drew from my exchanges in Almaty and Astana was that China is largely seen as an ineffective security actor. It was sidelined on the January 6th events in Kazakhstan. It had no role in the conflict between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. And more than that, it seemed to lack basic understanding of what was going on in the region. And I was told that China was looking to Russia for illumination on various topics and was not receiving it. And partly I was told this was because the diplomats in Kazakhstan in particular were more focused on geopolitical issues than on the politics of the country where they were based. So Zhang Xiao, the ambassador, was known for his wolf warrior type commentary, for example. And I think this reflects the overall level of US-China competition, which colors a lot of Chinese foreign policy in many parts of the world. But also because China's security interests in Central Asia are really connected to China's domestic security interests, not to the security interests of those states. So, of course, the Uyghur issue for China is a domestic issue, preventing terrorist spillover into China, preventing separatism that affects China. And so we see China participating in Tajikistan's border security. This is not because China wants to play a role in Central Asian security. This is because China is afraid of threats that could emanate from Kazakhstan because of its weak capabilities. And another issue that came up often during my stay was this the statement by Xi Jinping to Tokayev about sovereignty, that China would guarantee or would strongly support Kazakhstan sovereignty. And I think this was also overblown, that China was somehow going to be a security guarantor in the region. Well, if you think back to 2013, two things happened. One was that the Chinese government made such a statement to Ukraine. And look at how China is guaranteeing Ukraine's sovereignty at this moment. And also, Xi, when he gave his Belt and Road Initiative speech in Astana in 2013, also talked about the importance of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and so forth. So this is a standard position of Chinese diplomatic language. It is not anything new that is responding to the situation after the invasion of Ukraine. And so I think that there was some wishful thinking in Kazakhstan that somehow China was going to prevent Russians from crossing the border. But I think many also understood that this was a kind of a normal political rhetoric for a Chinese leader. Another striking term that I often heard in my conversations was toxic Russia. Often people describe Russia as toxic, the EEAU as toxic, but despite this, Russia was still remaining an important part. So it's the devil you had to deal with. Russia is there, it's not going anywhere. And I literally saw Kazakh experts going to great lengths to avoid alienating Russians, to try to maintain academic bonds, economic bonds, political ties, despite the opposition that many of them had for Russian policies. And so even though China's economic role is important and growing, Russia's still very significant and also involved economically somewhat differently than China, and sometimes in different sectors in different ways. So China also is aware of this. And I think Alex was right this morning to say that Russia and China are not necessarily competing in Central Asia, because China is very mindful of Russia's role there and also tries to avoid irritating Russia or obviously making initiatives that would be hard for Russia to accept. So what is China doing then in Central Asia? Like the US, China now has a C5+1 initiative started in July of 2020. And this was ostensibly because of COVID, to try to engage in health Silk Road diplomacy. I argued elsewhere this wasn't quite so successful, but it was interesting in that it was an initiative to engage separately with Central Asia in the absence of Russia. So typically China would engage within the SCO where Russia was present. So here China was creating a framework without Russia. That's interesting. And of course, the Belt and Road Initiative, the land route was announced in Astana, and that was the initial major direction for China's or Xi Jinping's grand connectivity initiative. For Central Asia, there's been a lot of discussion of what the Belt and Road has meant in terms of negative impacts, in terms of debt in particular. And I've looked mostly at Kazakhstan because of the project I'm working on, including Kazakhstan. And so if we look, Kazakhstan is a country that's supposed to be relatively less indebted to China compared to Kyrgyzstan or Tajikistan. And so officially its sovereign debt to China is less than 2%. But if you look at some of the great work that Aid Data has done on this, there is hidden debt. So unreported sovereign debt, which is another 5% GDP. And then another kind of hidden debt, which is loans to partially state-owned entities that the government of Kazakhstan implicitly guarantees. So that's another 16% of GDP. So you have this amount of debt that goes into some of these economic ties that Kazakhstan has on China, has with China. So another factor is the overdependence on the Chinese market. So this was something that Central Asian states have realized very clearly because the border with China was closed for 3 years during COVID, and they lost that market. And so that was a big wake-up call that they need to look for alternative markets because China might be huge, but maybe it won't be always available. And my area of interest in these meetings was to look at the environmental impacts of some of these projects. And there was a lot of dissatisfaction with China in terms of water usage because Kazakhstan is downstream from China. Ili River is drying up. You can see it literally by going there. Other waterways have less water. The water talks are difficult with China. Also pollution an issue. And there were a lot of people who are not even water experts were talking about this to me, sharing videos about this. And it was quite an important issue for many people in society. So this is from the point of view of Kazakhstan, the kind of risks that it faces in dealing with the Belt and Road Initiative and related economic projects. But China also faces risks in the region. And experts there talk about this, how China fears economic losses, non-repayment of these loans, for example. And they also fear the prospect of political instability in the Central Asian region and for the security of their own nationals who work there. Labor issues have been a big hot point with China typically bringing in workers to for employment on their investments, and that causes social dissatisfaction in the host country, but Chinese workers also worry for their security. And so that's why in some countries, China has created private security firms, which are not allowed in Kazakhstan though. And then there's the issue of Russia. So China has to tread carefully in these Belt and Road investments in Central Asia to avoid alienating strategic partner Russia. So looking at some specific projects, you have the digital Silk Road. So it's not only about moving fossil fuels and grains. Now it's about creating new communication methods, new technologies. And this would be a benefit. We talked earlier, Alex talked about IT networking, but there's a lot of fear about networking with China. What would that mean? There's resistance to China doing the coding, to China holding on to data. And so there's a lot of openness to engaging with other countries on these issues. So I think China has the package deal with its technologies in terms of the 5G, but they don't necessarily want that package because of these security concerns. And then there's the whole idea of China's Green Belt and Road. That was a new initiative even before COVID. And China invested in 52 or supposedly is investing in 52 projects in Kazakhstan. And if you look at what these projects are, there are some investments in renewables, but also some in fossil fuels. And so it's a mixed picture. So China is still maintaining the fossil fuel emphasis, but also engaging in solar and wind projects, as well as hydropower and nuclear. These projects were a hot topic because for many reasons. One was because the government of Kazakhstan was not very transparent about what these projects were. And that people were discussing, where could you find this information? And finally, an environmental activist, a friend of Sebastien, had the full list. But many people who would benefit from having the details didn't have it. And this led to a lot of negative feeling about what China was doing, the possible environmental consequences. It led to greater xenophobia, resistance to dealing with China as an economic partner. And also I was told that what compounds this is a overall lack of expertise on China in the region. So China is this huge new presence, but there aren't that many experts there ready to grapple with it. And then on the Chinese side, at the same time, so you have an untransparent government in Kazakhstan, but you have a nationalistic one in China that wants to show itself as belonging in the region. And you have some very ill-advised nationalistic writings. For example, there was one 2020 article about how some lands in Kazakhstan actually belong to China that was not sponsored by the Chinese government, but people in Kazakhstan interpreted it as a land grab by Beijing. And so you also have lack of transparency on the Chinese side about what is they're doing, how many workers are they bringing, what's going to benefit the society that they're working in, and so on. So you have a bit of a disconnect between the two. But regardless, China is there to stay, as is Russia. And so I think that Kazakhstan and other Central Asian states are trying to deal with these pressures and how they impact the desire that we heard for regional integration. I had the opportunity to hear an interesting talk by an Uzbek scholar named Farhad Talipov, who was talking about the different regional integration frameworks. And he talked about the US C5+1. And he, in his view, C5+1 for the US equals 5, because the focus is on integrating the 5 countries. But for Russia, C5+1 equals 1, because the point is that everyone is under the Russian umbrella. But for China, he didn't know. He said C5+1 equals X. Who knows? My guess, C5+1 for China is 1, also under China's umbrella.
He's told me that he wants to see C5+0.
Okay. C5+0, yes. They're doing that, right? So all of us, we've been talking about other countries. Turkey, we just heard. I think Turkey is a very interesting alternative because in addition to all of the economic, military, educational angles, it also has the cultural element. And you have the US, EU, India, Japan, South Korea, all with connectivity plans, but somehow lacking in capacity to implement them. And so I'm just going to conclude with one issue that I think is really promising that we've mentioned before, and that's the energy transition. And I think it's crucial because it reduces the dependence of these countries on Russia and China in terms of the fossil fuel connections, the fossil fuel investments. And one interesting investment we saw was by the EU in green hydrogen in Kazakhstan. And you have US AID and EBRD cooperating in decarbonization projects. And that's an area where Japan could also play a role. And I think it's just important for these countries because they face environmental threats that they need to deal with. They need new sectors of employment, and they need to find a way to be regionally autonomous. And so if they didn't have these fixed pipeline connections, then this would be more possible. So I'll just conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And our next speaker is Marinka Miles. We're going to talk about Russia enduring soft power in Central Asia. Is it a PowerPoint?
Hey, I'm here as George Mason University, but I also work for the Department of Defense, so I'm giving the disclaimer that these are my opinions, they do not represent the views of the US Department of Defense or the US government. So I'm a political anthropologist and cultural studies person, and I'm not a political scientist, so I look at it from all of these things from the angle of the ground up, from people and how their perspective. But I strongly believe that structures of government are created by people, and that they are, all of the countries, including Turkmenistan, have to be, especially right now, responsive to their populations. So I think it's really important that we look at it from that angle. Secondly, the war in Ukraine has really brought out the differences, the stark differences between the positions of the different Central Asian states. So I'll talk a little bit about that today. But first, I would say that Russia's waning influence is vastly overstated. So I'm going to talk about that today. And there are signs of waning. There's a lot of rhetoric, especially in Kazakhstan and decolonization, and maybe a little bit in Kyrgyzstan, that doesn't apply to the rest of the region. So a lot of times I'll see rhetoric that says, oh, there's this decolonization in all of Eurasia. It's Kazakhstan, it's not all of Eurasia. So that's one thing. But I want to focus on three main foundational intersecting levers of power that endure despite the war, and that they intersect, and they're really interdependent on each other. And the first one is migration, the second is language, and the third is the idea of traditional values. So let's see here. Okay. So migration over the past decade, all of the academic work, or the majority of the academic work, there's been books, movies, programs developed by UN organizations, each aid organization from all the different countries has focused a lot on migration, but it's focused on the hardships people have, the burden it is, the human rights things that they have to face while they're in Russia, and how hard it is to be a migrant worker. But that isn't painting the whole picture. And I think that this has really come out now. And I want to show that by showing the migration data. So we'll look at the less examined is the large population of naturalized citizens from Central Asia to Russia. And that migration is tiered. So you have people that are absorbed into the population. It's not all migrant laborers that come and live on the margins. That is maybe a third of some of it, but the rest of it are people who have connections, who have businesses, who have security connections, who work with those around them. So this shows the number of, so this is you see a lot of migration data these days, especially, and so there's a lot of variation. I'm going to try and break it out why those numbers are so different. But this one breaks down the number of Central Asians who have gotten Russian citizenship between 1992 to 2022, sorry. So you'll see Kazakhstan at the beginning. This is in the first wave, the first 10 years, it was about 1 million. But you'll see as it goes on, and we don't have all the data for 21 to 22 and if you look at it as a comparison to Ukraine, it's quite significant. So this doesn't even count the passportization policies for Ukraine. But if you get to Tajikistan, you'll see a big jump even in the last 2 years. So, and then we have to take into account the accumulation of those numbers, of the number of citizens that are Central Asians, but also Russian. So I'm going to break that down. So Russia has a dual citizenship policy with Turkmenistan and with Tajikistan. So that's a little bit different, but that doesn't mean if someone gets citizenship from Kyrgyzstan that they just give up their Kyrgyz citizenship. They may use both passports even though they're not supposed to be. So that's very common. So this is Russian worker permits by the thousands just between Tajikistan and Uzbekistan until 2018. And so I want to break down some of the data. When you look at her migration data, it'll say how many people are going. This is legal migration. So you've got naturalized citizens, permits, and then you have work permits. So permits, residence permits fall into 2 categories. So temporary, they last for 3 years, but you have to renew them every year. And then there's permanent residency permits, which are indefinite. So you can come and go and be resident in Russia and it protects you. You have all the social benefits. You have healthcare, you have education, as if you were a citizen in many ways. So we haven't been looking at that either. So this just shows those numbers per year, not accumulative. So you see how it's gone up. Uzbekistan has the most because they have the most population, but Tajikistan has the most per capita. So this is Russian residency permits from cumulative between 2012 to 2018. So we can assume probably most of those people remain in Russia or have the ability to go back and forth to Russia freely. And that doesn't count the last couple of years. And this is Russian citizenship between 2012 to 2022. Accumulative, it doesn't count the first decade. So, and this is the low end. So if you look at some of this, it wouldn't be, so Tajikistan, if you count the first decade, it's 300,000, so it'd be up to 1 million almost already. And you can see there the discrepancy between the population size and the number of citizens. And this is kind of what that looks like. I've put the conservative numbers in the bubble. So if you've got about 5 to 10% of the population that either have permanent residency, are able to migrate with work permits to Russia from Kyrgyzstan, or are citizens. 5 to 8% of Uzbekistan, about 20% of Kazakhs, and 20 to 30% of Tajikistan. So let that sink in. I think if you look at Tajikistan, on the low end, the low estimate would be 20%. That is the equivalent, if you go percentage-wise, of all of California and all of Texas combined living in another country. So that impact, that political impact is huge. Imagine all of Texas, California living in Canada, and then the country being reliant on that money. So this is more what that looks like. So you've got 5 to 10% that are Russian citizens, 7 to 75% maybe remaining, 10% with residency permits, and 10% labor migrants legally. So all of these are legal numbers. It doesn't count any migrants that go illegally and work illegally in the country. So again, because Tajikistan's on the one end of the spectrum, and I want to highlight that. So if you see this, some of the data, when you get a gap in the data, Tajikistan will measure number of migrants going out of the country that do not have Russian citizenship. So if you have a Russian citizenship and you're going back and forth, they're not measuring you exiting, but when you go into Russia, they're measuring you either way. So Russia's going to have a higher number than Tajikistan's data. And that's one of the reasons you see those discrepancies. And you can see here, like it fell a lot during COVID, but you also see how Tajikistan's become a transnational state where migrants go back and forth with citizenship and permits all the time, as if both places are home. And then despite the war, between January 23 to January 21, Tajikistan had a huge dump in the number of people who got citizenship. It was about 60 to 70,000 per year before that. Then it jumped to about 106,000. And then it was almost 173,000 last year after the war started. And we're on schedule to go higher this year. And they granted more permits, almost 300,000, I think, to Tajik citizens. So I think, and so in the first 6 months of 22, over 74,000 Tajiks gained Russian citizenship. That's nearly 410 people per day. And in April 22, the Duma changed the law to ease the rules of becoming citizens. And by the end of 2021, there had been 96,000 who had permanent residency in Russia, enabling them to become the next 2 years a citizen. And so it's a really high number. And so you think that even during the war, it's only going up. And so a lot of citizens, they don't want to be recruited into the war, but they still want citizenship. So I interviewed a guy who said he had left because he didn't want to fight in the war. He had just gotten citizenship, he had studied there. And then he went home, but he had to then fight. Tajikistan and Russia have a dual military service agreement. So if you serve in the Tajik military and you're a Russian citizen and Tajik citizen, you don't have to serve in the Russian military. if you're a Tajik Russian citizen and you're serving in Russia, you don't have to serve in Tajikistan. But because he hadn't fulfilled his duty, he had to go home and serve, but he could pay off. There's a tax fee you can pay off if you're wealthy enough, and then you don't have to serve at all. And when I asked him about how he felt about this, he really felt like, and at that time there were already Tajiks being repatriated, the bodies were being repatriated to Tajikistan from the war, and he said, for where he lived, it didn't really matter because this is a very cynical view of his, but that they were more worried about the people being killed on the Kyrgyz-Tajik border. That was more important and pressing in the minds of Tajik citizens, and that on average, about 1,000 Tajiks are repatriated in boxes each year as migrant workers, and so their families kind of saw it as a risk either way. That did change when I circled back to him after mobilization, because he had friends that the borders were locked down and they couldn't leave. But they still, many people I interviewed use the word homeland. They still saw Russia as a kind of homeland. And I don't think we realize that there's that deep connection with a lot of Central Asians. And even if there was a great Medusa podcast in February 6th where they talked about a lot of the Kyrgyz coming back, that they were counted as Russians fleeing, but they were actually Russian Kyrgyz fleeing back into Kyrgyzstan, and they identified themselves as Russian and kind of better than their fellow countrymen once they got back. So the next one is Russian language, and a lot of this has to do with migration, the socioeconomic mobility. And if you know you want to go to study in Russia, or if you know you want to work in Russia, then you want to know the Russian language, and it provides you a better job. So there's no reliable current data on language uses in context, and despite there's a rise in domestic local use driven by decolonization narratives especially, it doesn't mean there's less Russian use or less Russian demand. It means that it's not a zero-sum game. It doesn't mean Kazakh people want to learn Kazakh, but then they're not going to use Russian anymore. That's not what we see happening. And it remains in demand, and the demand is probably going to grow, but it's also a bottom-up and top-down dynamic for language use in the regions. So the bottom-up is social mobility, political and economic. So people will try to get their children into Russian-speaking schools from preschool or to higher education. It's the job market, so migration for international organizations or NGOs, you have to know Russian or English. You can't just know the local language. And some of those are the best jobs in Central Asia. And it's also used in government, in international business. And it's considered more prestigious, and a lot of people see you as more educated if you know Russian. And then the top down, it's promoted jointly by the states and the Russian government. So the regional governments, within the region, the governments seek Russian teachers and textbooks. And this year is the year of Russian language, and that covers Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Azerbaijan. So this is from the website of I can't say it says, I think it's Russian language, the code of the nations. And so this is from the website where they're promoting this, and this is going on now, and it was slated from before the war. And I don't know if any other countries pulled out of it, but they're all participating.
We can move the Zoom window a little bit. It's possible. We can move the Zoom window to see the titles. Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. Let me see if I can do that. I don't know how to move it out of the way. If you want to just move this.
No, just to move the window.
They want to be able to see the top.
We'll just add the full further.
I think you can drag.
Oh, yeah.
That's from the website. So I'm not sure if other countries in Central Asia were going to be part of it before the war. I can't imagine Kazakhstan would remain on board with it, but it is happening. And part of that is they want more in August 22, Kyrgyzstan complained that it was not providing enough textbooks, for example. And since 2013, Tajikistan as president has reached out to Russia and begged for more teachers and begged for more books. In 2013, he was denied. Moscow said no. In 2019 and Moscow and Dushanbe signed an agreement for new Russian schools. They fulfilled this even though it cost 120 million USD, even during the war. And when the schools opened in September 2021, there were protests outside the schools because parents were angry that kids couldn't get in. So it's really that critical and important. And then, so just I'm running out of time here, so I'll just do a little bit of.
Doesn't guarantee that the slides are coming.
Yeah.
There we go. It's Shauna, I had moved the mouse. Okay, so 10% of all schools this is in Uzbekistan. So it says Uzbekistan at the top. There are Russian pedagogical schools, and 53% of schools are Russian in Tashkent. So in 2021, there was 130 Russian native speakers, 100,000 textbooks, and they're supposed to give them 600,000 more. So I'm just gonna. But this one. Oh dear. Where did the?
Yeah, it's like.
Oh no, it's at the
Bottom left.
see it on this.
Bottom left.
Yeah.
You have to scroll bottom left and it appears.
Ah,
Back over. There we go. And this one is for Tajikistan. So let's skip that one. All right. Okay, so this is the number of students studying from 2017 to 2003 in Russia. So and you'll notice that this is the number of ones that are allocated by quotas and given. Some of them are given scholarships. And Russia's increasing that across the region for each year. You'll see in 2023, this is per school year, so it's 22-23 school year. And Wishnick just visited Dushanbe, and he said that next year it will be 35,000. So they're raising the number. And so if you look at the data, they try to keep it at a good, like there's about 10% regularly studying. Of all those studying in higher institutions in Uzbekistan, about 10% are studying in Russia. And even in Kyrgyzstan, where they have lower migration, lower number of students studying, it's still about 10% of their total secondary or higher education numbers. So, and then related to that is the idea of traditional values, and that really goes with language and the way people communicate and understand what traditional values are. And when I think about soft power and what traditional values are and how important they are, it's not something necessarily, soft power is something that resonates with the population. You don't have to push it on them. So this really works in Central Asia because it's something that they already accept and acknowledge in a way that they don't feel like they can connect with the United States in the same way. It's also nebulous. It also means an idea of cultural sovereignty, like we have our culture, you can't push your culture on us, you can't encroach on our cultural sovereignty. It's nebulous in a way that you don't have to define it. It can be what you want it to be. And then it's pro-traditional family, and that's flexible. So traditional family in Central Asia, you can get divorced. You can also have polygyny, so you can practice polygyny. That's still considered traditional. What it doesn't mean is LGBTQ. So it's anti-Western in that way. It's also anti-feminist. So for example, Kyrgyzstan just used this on the Women's March on March 8th this year. When the Kyrgyz women marched, they had a counter protest that said we're supporting traditional values. So they didn't define, you don't have to define what that is. It's just not that. They can just point to, we don't have to tell you what it is, but we know it's not that. It's also patriotic and patriotic education. And this is where we maybe we'll start seeing some copying of more Russian laws where they have instituted patriotic education. They tried this recently in Tajikistan, and the population, it says, oh, it's just like the Soviet Union. So then that's how they view it, especially the older generation. We'll see how it works out for them. But those are the things that I really wanted to touch upon and what those are. And those, I think we don't realize how connected they are through migration and what it means to them. And then maybe they don't see necessarily Russia as anti-democratic. Maybe they see problems now. Nobody wants to go to war, for example. But a lot of Central Asians find that they have more religious freedom in Russia. So they find that they can go there, they can get Islamic education, they can work within the community as religious leaders, where they can't do that at home. So in that way, they see it as more of a place of freedom. And I think that we may have failed to recognize that reality. And with that, I'll wrap it up.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Monica. All right, so we have, let's say about 10 minutes for discussion. So I'm gonna give priority to this lady who was wanting to ask the question here. Yes, please. Microphone.
This question is for Gavin. Will you say that US has double standards treating authoritarian regimes in Central Asia and Putin? Mirziyoyev is like Putin. He murdered innocent people in Pakistan. He sentences journalists into prison, tortures in prison, and yet the US doesn't treat Uzbekistan the same way it treats Russia. And also Russia is a best friend with Uzbekistan. And recently Freedom Azatlik Radio, they published investigative article about the crimes of Russia and Uzbekistan in gas industry. So my another question is about US interest in Central Asia. In 1950, US helped South Korea, and many American officials, they don't realize much about history of Central Asia. Karakkal, Pakistan in 1993 entered into temporary agreement with Uzbekistan. The agreement expired in 2013, but Uzbekistan since then, they were jailing and murdering everyone who raises that question. So my question is for you, if US will consider being there and bringing a hope, because currently Karakalpak people are living hell on earth. Many people now know about Uyghurs in China, but they have no idea about Karakalpakstan. They cannot even speak their own language in their land. They cannot write in that language. And there is clear ethnic cleansing. And regarding energy, quickly, just energy-wise, you know, we have hot summers and windy region, so that could be used. The USSR used Karakalpakstan as the biggest biochemical weapon testing center. Now the West, US and Europe could use it as a place of innovation. Right now, Europe is struggling with gas, and we have plenty of that.
Okay, do you want to answer? Or maybe you sure? Okay, all right, go ahead, David. I take your question.
Well, okay, does the US have a double standard vis-a-vis Putin and vis-a-vis Mirziyoyev or others who are authoritarians? I would say we probably, if not a double standard, we have a schizophrenia about authoritarian regimes, which is authoritarian regimes that are clearly our opponents globally are ones that we tend to write, you know, long articles about and describe in very toxic ways. Countries where we don't have an overarching US policy agenda are areas where we're probably willing to not get in it as involved in others. And that's just a reality, because I think, you know, part of having a more humble foreign policy probably has something to do with America going through what is, I think, a repetitive cycle of moving from interventionism towards isolationism, towards not getting involved. And I think you don't have to go very far in listening to U.S. rhetoric in the Congress, U.S. Congress, to hear voices that are isolationist again. So that's part of a larger thing. I think the other extreme is when the United States, for lack of any other agenda with foreign governments, will harp on human rights issues. So there's a balance of figuring out what we can actually affect, what we have leverage over. And one of the first things that I said, and I think is true about Central Asia, is the United States does not have the leverage in the region to force governments to do much of anything, and we certainly don't have the same leverage that China or Russia do, being right there.
Sure. Yeah.
Hi, Christopher Von Clapper from Eurasia Foundation. I think the question I was previously asked, I was also asking in a way regarding human rights as a third engagement. I think that's kind of I've not seen that as a priority, but on another angle, I would be curious how US foreign policy is addressing inequalities in the region, which I think is only growing, unfortunately, right? Thinking about economic inequality, gender inequality, it's something that I see other governments, namely Russia and China, addressing more directly. And I was curious if we're seeing more engagement through that, or if you think that's kind of fallen to the wayside. Thank you.
Well, I would say overall, I think US foreign policy is becoming less about exporting values and certainly less about doing that using hard power, which reflects lessons observed, if not learned, from the previous 20 years. But yeah, I mean, clearly there is less of a tendency to go in and finger wag, and part of that is because of Russian narratives about what we do. I thought it was interesting that Xi Jinping and Putin agreed to not let us promote colored revolutions. We're not promoting colored revolutions necessarily all that much, but it's an easy thing to attack us on.
And on human rights, like Russia has a human rights commission internally, and even if the US doesn't see it that way, that doesn't mean Central Asians don't see it that way. They may see that there's human rights there for them in the way that they like, not the way that the US wants.
I would add that China does not address economic inequality in Central Asia, but they contribute to it in their wage structures, which is what people protest about, that their own workers are paid higher wages than local workers.
It all comes down to, if you can imagine, over the last 20 years, when something bad happens in the world, in the White House Situation Room, they say, what are we going to do about it? I think that question gets asked less post-Afghanistan than it has been.
All right. Yeah, I mean, I can take only. Okay, let's take two more questions. Katie first, and then we really need to conclude. I'm so sorry.
Sure. Catherine Potts, managing editor of The Diplomat. My question is inspired by Marintha's presentation for Elizabeth. However, do you see any Chinese efforts to pursue engagement in those areas of soft power that Marintha outlined, migration, language, traditional values? Do you see this as an area of activity or less activity? Thank you.
And we'll take your question, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Diana. I don't really represent any organization, but since Flex program was mentioned, I'm now on that Future Leaders Exchange program. I'm so glad that border issue is being put on the agenda when we are, today at this security workshop, because previously I've noticed that in DC environment, we didn't really speak so much about border before, as much as now, for an obvious reasons, but I'm not gonna, talk about this. When I was writing my research here as part of the Central Asian program, I argued for looking at the existing practices on cooperation in Central Asia, that we need to build on those and not necessarily look at what doesn't work. And this idea of grassroots peace building, I think, is important, and something that Gavin, you mentioned on importance of rebuilding the kind of connectivity. But at the same time, I look at what is the real picture of what is happening now. The border issues are being left in complete isolation from people on the ground, led by just political elite. And also you see the growing hostility on the ground. Assel mentioned before that people are not returning back to their, home places in the southern region. And there is nationalism, growing nationalism, etc. So I wonder, what are the real perspectives when it comes to bridging top level, national and local level peace building, both within the countries, but also between the countries in the region. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you for that question on China. I think that's an area where China has been devoting attention and resources in terms of teaching Chinese language, providing scholarships, opportunities for students from the region to study in China. However, public opinion surveys rank China fairly low. And so partly it depends on the audience that's questioned. But as those of us who are on exchange programs in other countries know, just being in another country doesn't mean you're going to be feel positively about that country. So I think China is tries to work on the soft power, but doesn't see how other actions that it takes counteract those efforts.
I would say quickly that I mean, there's two questions. What can we do about it, meaning Americans, and then what I think is happening. And I think a lot of that has to border conflicts can be resolved if you build up, early warning mechanisms, resource sharing mechanisms, learn to, figure out how you're going to deal with pastures, water resources, road access. That theoretically isn't rocket science, right? It can be done. Look at Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan did it, right? So it can be done. That's a technical issue. I think I read that, the Kyrgyz and the Tajik have met now 700 times to try to do some border, resolution. The bigger question is the political question of, hate to do this, but who is benefiting from those conflicts, whether, it's Japarov and Rahmon trying to, displace discontent about COVID responses or whatever it is that led to that, whether it's drug routes that are getting renegotiated because of reconfiguration of how poppies flow in Afghanistan. So there's a technical question, and we can help with that, or as the Tajiks will often say, we can work that out. It's bilateral. We don't need Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan to help us, do what should be just a bilateral thing. And it's really about political will. On the positive side, I don't know what the motivation is. Maybe he's, trying to make, Tasheev look bad, but Japarov appears to be putting a lot of effort into trying to do that technical piece on that. And then what I was talking about, which is working with those communities to actually regulate the issues. Most of those border conflicts, right? They spark up, they last for a couple of days, and then they go away. They don't always develop into a all border, escalation of conflict. So, I think that those technical questions can be dealt with, and that's the it shouldn't be that hard to figure out how to get road access to Varuk. If you can make that agreement. The question is whether there's political will.
Okay, all right. Okay, so we are late, so we really need to conclude. I'm really sorry. So first, I would like to thank our panelists for this the great presentation, the discussion. I would also like to thank all the panelists of this long day. A special thank you again to those who joined us from abroad. And we had Assel, we from Kazakhstan, we had Timur from who was in Kyrgyzstan, sorry. We had Piri, who was in Australia, so really thank you. And thank you, of course, to our audience who was with us today for the questions. And we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you very, very much.